What if the Vietnam War had been avoided? Imagine a world where one of the most devastating conflicts of the 20th century never happened. No nightly news showing burning jungles, no draft tearing families apart, no protests shaking the streets of America. But could the Vietnam War really have been avoided? And if so, how different would the world, and America, look today? Let's dive deep into this alternate history, where diplomacy triumphs over war, and explore the global ripple effects of peace in Southeast Asia. The Vietnam War wasn't an inevitable tragedy. It didn't explode from a single spark, but slowly smoldered through years of missed opportunities, misplaced fears, and deeply flawed assumptions. To truly understand how this devastating conflict could have been avoided, we need to travel back in time, back to a world reshaping itself in the chaotic aftermath of World War II. In 1945, as the world celebrated victory over fascism, another struggle was brewing. In Vietnam, a small nation long colonized by France, a bold leader named Ho Chi Minh stood before his people and declared independence. And in a powerful gesture, he borrowed words from one of America's most sacred texts, the Declaration of Independence. He spoke of liberty, justice, and the inalienable rights of all people. It was a clear message, not just to France, but to the entire world, that Vietnam sought freedom, not domination. But the United States, gripped by the rising tensions of the Cold War, didn't see Ho Chi Minh as a nationalist seeking independence. Instead, Washington viewed him as a dangerous communist allied with Moscow and Beijing. This fear of global communism, a fear that would shape American foreign policy for decades, clouded their judgment. In our alternate history, this is where the first fork in the road appears. Imagine if U.S. leaders, instead of lumping Ho Chi Minh together with Stalin and Mao, had recognized him as a nationalist first and a communist second. Imagine if they'd seen Vietnam's struggle for independence as an echo of America's own fight against colonialism, rather than a Soviet plot to expand communism in Asia. In this scenario, the United States makes a bold choice: diplomacy over confrontation. Instead of pouring money and weapons into France's failing colonial war, America steps forward as a mediator. They leverage their post-war influence to encourage France to negotiate with Ho Chi Minh and respect Vietnam's desire for independence. France, battered by the horrors of World War II and facing growing anti-colonial movements elsewhere, accepts the reality that its colonial empire is crumbling. With U.S. support, an international conference, similar to the Geneva Accords of 1954 but held earlier, perhaps in 1946, brings together all stakeholders. Under American leadership, the conference recognizes Vietnam as a neutral, independent nation, committed to self-determination and open to peaceful trade with the West. Much like Switzerland in Europe or Laos and Cambodia in Southeast Asia, Vietnam becomes a country where global powers agree to respect its neutrality. Of course, Cold War fears don't vanish overnight. The domino theory, the belief that one nation falling to communism would cause neighboring countries to collapse like a row of dominoes, still lurks in the background. But in this timeline, the United States doesn't respond with bombs and troops. Instead, they fight for hearts and minds. America launches a campaign of economic aid, education exchanges, and cultural diplomacy in Southeast Asia. They build roads, schools, and hospitals in Vietnam, Thailand, and the Philippines. Instead of helicopter gunships, they send engineers and teachers. Instead of napalm, they spread American ideals of freedom and prosperity. Vietnam's neutral stance becomes a model for the region. Southeast Asia doesn't become a battleground of superpowers, but a frontier of peaceful competition. The U.S. and the Soviet Union still jockey for influence globally, but Southeast Asia becomes a rare example where restraint wins out over aggression. There's also a shift in American political thinking. Without the need to escalate militarily in Vietnam, Washington begins to question the blind application of the domino theory. Leaders recognize that nationalism and communism aren't always the same. Not every anti-colonial movement is a Soviet proxy. This more nuanced understanding prevents future conflicts from spiraling out of control. And what about Ho Chi Minh himself? Instead of becoming America's bitter enemy, perhaps he becomes a partner in balancing regional power. His government, free from constant warfare, focuses on rebuilding the country, developing agriculture, and fostering trade. Vietnam could emerge as a stable, prosperous nation far earlier than it did in our real-world timeline. Could this path have solved all of Southeast Asia's problems? Certainly not. Regional rivalries, ethnic tensions, and economic challenges would still exist. But by avoiding the Vietnam War, the U.S. spares itself and Vietnam decades of suffering, death, and political turmoil. This alternate path reminds us that history is not a straight line. It's a web of choices made by human beings. Choices driven by fear, ambition, compassion, and vision. If America had chosen diplomacy in Vietnam, it's possible that the Cold War might have played out with fewer battlegrounds and more negotiations. But perhaps the most important lesson from this scenario is that empathy matters. Had U.S. leaders seen Ho Chi Minh not just as a communist, but as a patriot, they might have realized that Vietnam's struggle was less about global ideology and more about national independence. And recognizing that could have made all the difference. This historical fork in the road shows us that war is not always inevitable. Sometimes, all it takes to change the course of history is a single act of understanding. What happens to a nation when a war that tore through its soul never takes place? For the United States, the Vietnam War was more than just a distant conflict. It was a war fought on two fronts, one in the jungles of Southeast Asia, and another in the streets, campuses, and living rooms of America. But in a world where that war never begins, the ripple effects on American society would have been nothing short of transformative. Let's start with the most immediate impact, the absence of the draft. In our timeline, millions of young American men were pulled from their homes and schools and sent halfway across the world to fight a war many didn't understand and most didn't support. But in this alternate reality, those draft notices never arrive. The selective service system still exists, but it doesn't drag thousands into a jungle conflict. Think about how this changes the college campuses of the 1960s. Instead of student protests erupting in outrage over the war and the draft, campus activism could have focused more fully on other pressing social issues: civil rights, poverty, women's equality, and environmental protection. The divide between young people and the political establishment wouldn't have been as raw, as painful, or as violent. The civil rights movement, in particular, might have progressed faster and further. Without Vietnam dominating headlines and political debates, the national spotlight could have remained fixed on the struggle for racial equality. Martin Luther King Jr., who in our timeline risked his popularity by speaking out against the war, would not have faced the backlash from political leaders who wanted him to stay silent on foreign policy. Lyndon B. Johnson, freed from the distractions and unpopularity of the Vietnam conflict, could have pushed his Great Society programs even further. Medicare and Medicaid may have expanded more quickly and thoroughly. Education reform, public housing initiatives, and anti-poverty programs like the War on Poverty might have received sustained attention and funding. Imagine a 1968 where Johnson, not tarnished by war, runs for and possibly wins re-election. His legacy could have rivaled FDR's in terms of social reform. The 1970s might have become a decade of American renewal, not just one of disillusionment and division. And what about American culture? The 1960s and 70s would still be turbulent times. The generation gap between baby boomers and their parents, the rise of rock and roll, the sexual revolution, these social currents were already surging before Vietnam. But without the war as a central point of conflict, these generational clashes would likely have been less bitter. Music might still have questioned authority, but it wouldn't be drenched in images of war. Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, and countless others sang of peace and justice. Without Vietnam, their lyrics might have focused more on civil rights, workers' rights, or environmental causes. Hollywood and literature, too, would have evolved differently. Without Vietnam shaping the lens through which Americans viewed their government, we may never have seen the same level of cynicism that colored 1970s cinema. Movies like Apocalypse Now, Platoon, and Full Metal Jacket wouldn't exist as we know them. Instead, filmmakers and writers might have explored different American anxieties, corporate power, racial injustice, or nuclear fears. But perhaps the most profound change would have been in America's trust in its own government. The Vietnam War didn't just claim lives overseas, it shattered confidence at home. The release of the Pentagon Papers, which revealed the government's misleading statements about the war's progress, fueled a growing sense that American leaders couldn't be trusted. While scandals like Watergate likely still happen, human nature being what it is, the sense of betrayal wouldn't have been compounded by years of deception about Vietnam. In this alternate timeline, Watergate is a singular event, not part of a broader pattern of government lies. Americans remain skeptical of power, but perhaps not outright cynical. The phrase credibility gap might never enter the American vocabulary. The absence of the Vietnam War also changes the trajectory of the anti-war movement. Instead of being defined by resistance to war, many of the activists who led protests might have thrown their full weight behind pushing for civil rights legislation, environmental protections, or economic equality. Groups like the Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, might have become powerful forces for progressive change rather than splintering under the pressures of war. And what of the veterans? In our timeline, returning soldiers faced a nation torn by protest and anger. Many were met with indifference or hostility. In our alternate reality, there is no mass cohort of traumatized Vietnam vets returning home to a divided country. The complex and often painful legacy of Vietnam veterans, struggling with PTSD, health issues, and societal rejection, never materializes. The absence of war also alters the military-industrial complex. Without the massive buildup and spending that Vietnam required, America's defense budget still grows in response to the Cold War, but perhaps more measuredly. Resources might have been directed towards space exploration, scientific innovation, and domestic infrastructure instead of military escalation. Of course, not every American conflict disappears in this timeline. The struggle for racial justice, gender equality, and environmental protection still face fierce opposition. But without Vietnam siphoning away political will and public attention, these battles might have gained momentum earlier. In the end, avoiding the Vietnam War removes one of the most painful chapters of American history. It spares a generation from the horrors of combat and the divisions of protest. It allows America to focus on healing its own deep wounds rather than opening new ones abroad. A more unified, confident, and socially progressive America emerges, still imperfect, but perhaps better prepared to face the challenges of the late 20th century. The Cold War was a high-stakes chess match played across every continent. For decades, the United States and the Soviet Union maneuvered their pawns and knights in proxy wars, revolutions, and ideological conflicts. Vietnam was one of the bloodiest squares on that chessboard. But what if that piece had never been moved? Without the Vietnam War, the Cold War remains intense, but far less deadly, especially in Southeast Asia. Let's reimagine the global political landscape without that critical conflict and see how the Cold War might have evolved differently. First, let's talk about China. In our timeline, the Vietnam War was not just about Vietnam. It was a battleground where China sought to expand its influence and challenge American power. China provided weapons, supplies, and ideological support to North Vietnam, asserting itself as a major communist player on the world stage. But in this alternate reality, without Vietnam as a proxy conflict, China loses a crucial arena to project its influence. And here's where it gets interesting. Without the antagonism and deep mistrust bred during the Vietnam conflict, U.S.-China relations might warm far earlier. In our world, Richard Nixon's historic 1972 visit to China opened diplomatic channels after decades of isolation. But in this alternate timeline, perhaps that thaw happens in the late 1960s. Without Vietnam poisoning the waters, American strategists recognized the opportunity to split the communist world by engaging China against the Soviet Union, a move that, in our history, reshaped global power dynamics. Now let's shift our gaze to Southeast Asia. In our timeline, the Vietnam War destabilized the entire region. Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand became battlegrounds or staging grounds in the conflict. Governments toppled. Guerrilla movements rose. But in this alternate world, with Vietnam neutral and independent, the rest of Southeast Asia faces less external pressure to pick a side in the Cold War. Countries like Thailand, Malaysia, and Laos might continue on a more peaceful, neutral path, choosing neither Moscow nor Washington. These nations could develop stronger regional ties through trade and diplomacy, rather than through militarization and foreign alliances. The creation of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, in 1967, might take on greater significance sooner, fostering economic cooperation and reducing the temptation of Cold War meddling. And perhaps most tragically of all, without the chaos spilling over from Vietnam, Cambodia avoids its darkest chapter. In our timeline, the Vietnam War destabilized Cambodia's government, leading to a power vacuum filled by the Khmer Rouge, a brutal communist regime responsible for one of the worst genocides of the 20th century. But without Vietnam's collapse next door, the Khmer Rouge may have remained a fringe movement, never seizing control, sparing Cambodia the horrific loss of nearly 2 million lives. On the broader global stage, without Vietnam draining American resources and attention, Washington's Cold War strategy shifts. In our reality, the Vietnam quagmire tied up U.S. money, manpower, and political will, giving the Soviet Union more room to maneuver elsewhere. But in this alternate timeline, America is free to focus earlier and more effectively on other flashpoints. Eastern Europe could be one of the first places to feel the shift. The U.S. might more proactively support dissident movements in Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. Instead of waiting until the late 1980s, democratic uprisings in Eastern Europe might gain momentum sooner, as American attention isn't consumed by a distant jungle war. And in the developing world, where the U.S. and Soviet Union often fought proxy battles through coups and insurgencies, America might have responded more strategically. In Africa, where communist and anti-communist forces clashed in Angola, Ethiopia, and elsewhere, a less distracted America could have promoted economic aid and diplomacy rather than relying on military proxies. In the Middle East, where the Soviets sought influence during the Arab-Israeli conflicts, a more focused America might have balanced power more effectively, potentially stabilizing the region earlier. But let's be clear, the Cold War itself doesn't disappear. The ideological divide between capitalism and communism remains, and both superpowers continue to compete for influence. But the character of the conflict changes. Without Vietnam as a bloody cautionary tale, the U.S. doesn't suffer the same crisis of confidence. There is no Vietnam syndrome, no hesitation about asserting American influence abroad. This could lead to a more assertive U.S. foreign policy, but one tempered by the lesson of restraint learned from diplomatic successes in Southeast Asia. And what about the Soviet Union? Without Vietnam to point to as evidence of American imperialism, Soviet propaganda loses a potent symbol. The USSR still faces internal economic problems and rising dissent from satellite states. Without America bogged down in Asia, the Soviets might feel the pressure of containment more acutely, forcing them to divert resources and possibly accelerating their eventual collapse. Perhaps most intriguing is the possibility of an earlier thaw in U.S.-Soviet relations. In our world, détente, the easing of Cold War tensions, began in the 1970s after both sides had suffered through countless proxy wars and military standoffs. But without Vietnam poisoning diplomatic efforts, détente might arrive earlier and more sincerely. Treaties like the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT, and later agreements to reduce nuclear stockpiles could happen in the late 1960s, sparing the world some of the terror of nuclear brinkmanship. This new Cold War world is still tense, still dangerous, but less blood-soaked. It's a Cold War where diplomacy plays a bigger role than proxy battles, where America's global strategy is shaped by engagement rather than entanglement. The global chessboard remains set, but the game plays out with fewer pawns sacrificed along the way. Let's shift our focus from global power struggles to the people of Southeast Asia, especially the Vietnamese, who, in our real history, bore the brunt of a brutal conflict that stretched across decades. What would their country and their lives have looked like in a world without war? In this alternate timeline, Vietnam is not a battlefield. It is not divided into North and South, nor is it forced to choose between American capitalism and Soviet communism. Instead, Vietnam emerges from the shadows of colonialism as a neutral, independent nation, much like Austria after World War II or Switzerland in the heart of Europe. It is a country committed not to ideological wars, but to the practical work of building its economy and safeguarding its sovereignty. In the years following independence, Vietnam turns its energy toward nation-building, not nation-breaking. American and European investment flows into the country, not bombs and napalm. American companies see Vietnam not as an enemy to defeat, but as a market to nurture. European powers, having learned the costs of colonial ambition, support infrastructure development, agriculture, and manufacturing instead of propping up old colonial systems. Vietnam's economic model might follow in the footsteps of post-war success stories like South Korea, Singapore, or Malaysia. With a young, motivated population and a wealth of natural resources, Vietnam quickly rises as an industrial hub and a center of trade in Southeast Asia. Its ports bustle with international commerce, and its cities become hubs for technology, textiles, and tourism. Education and healthcare systems receive priority in this Vietnam. Instead of bombed-out villages, we see new schools teaching the next generation of Vietnamese engineers, doctors, and diplomats. Instead of jungles scarred by Agent Orange, we see national parks preserved for future generations. The brain drain of war never happens. Vietnam's brightest minds stay home, helping their country flourish rather than fleeing as refugees. And Vietnam's peaceful rise strengthens the entire region. ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, founded in 1967, gains a powerful new member in a stable, neutral Vietnam. Without the war-disrupting regional politics, ASEAN's growth accelerates. Economic cooperation, shared infrastructure projects, and joint security agreements emerge earlier and with greater unity. Countries like Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines collaborate more closely with Vietnam, balancing regional power without needing to lean on distant superpowers. Even Vietnam's neighbors benefit from its stability. Without war spilling across its borders, Cambodia avoids the horror of the Khmer Rouge regime. In our world, the chaos of Vietnam destabilized Cambodia, leading to a power vacuum that allowed Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge to seize control, unleashing genocide that killed nearly 2 million people. But in this alternate timeline, Cambodia's government holds steady, and its people are spared one of history's darkest chapters. Likewise, Laos, a small mountainous country caught between larger powers, finds balance and neutrality. It avoids becoming a battleground for proxy wars and builds peaceful relations with its neighbors. Instead of secret bombings and covert wars, Laos develops tourism, trade, and cultural exchange. And let's not forget the American side of the story. Without the Vietnam War, hundreds of thousands of American troops never deploy overseas. Families are not torn apart by the draft. Young men do not return home haunted by the jungle. The Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, D.C., etched with the names of over 58,000 fallen soldiers, never needs to be built. Not because the war was forgotten, but because it was never fought. The scars that war carved into American hearts and minds are never inflicted. The ripple effects extend beyond the battlefield. American society, spared the trauma of Vietnam, moves forward without the deep divisions that defined the 1970s. Veterans are celebrated not as survivors of an unpopular war, but perhaps as peaceful envoys and builders of international goodwill. The bitter national debates over military intervention, the morality of war, and the treatment of returning soldiers never consume the country's consciousness. And what of Vietnam's role in the broader world? A peaceful Vietnam becomes a bridge between East and West. It hosts diplomatic summits, leads regional peace talks, and advocates for non-aligned cooperation. Its cities, Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh City, Da Nang, become known for their innovation and economic vitality rather than for their destruction. Vietnam, once a symbol of division, transforms into a beacon of what peaceful independence can achieve. Its rise inspires other post-colonial nations to pursue paths of development rather than conflict, showing that emerging from colonial rule does not have to mean choosing sides in someone else's Cold War. Of course, challenges remain. No nation escapes poverty and hardship overnight. Vietnam still faces questions of governance, economic inequality, and rural development. But without war destroying its infrastructure, dividing its people, and poisoning its soil, Vietnam tackles these challenges from a place of strength, not devastation. And as Vietnam prospers, so too does Southeast Asia. The region, no longer overshadowed by foreign armies, writes its own story of growth and cooperation. In this peaceful Southeast Asia, trade routes flourish, cultural exchange deepens, and nations rise together rather than fall divided. This is the Vietnam that could have been, a Vietnam not of war and heartbreak, but of peace and promise. A Vietnam that shows what is possible when nations choose diplomacy over destruction. The Vietnam War ended nearly 50 years ago, but its echoes still reverberate through American life. Now imagine a world where those echoes never existed. Imagine a modern United States and a modern Vietnam whose shared history was marked by trade agreements and cultural exchanges, not by war memorials and battlefield scars. The long-term legacy of avoiding the Vietnam War would ripple far beyond Southeast Asia. It would reshape the very soul of America, and perhaps the trajectory of the entire world. Let's start with the Cold War's conclusion. In our reality, the Vietnam War fractured American resolve and consumed vast amounts of political energy and public trust. By the time the Cold War finally ended in 1991, the United States was victorious, but also weary, cautious about engaging in foreign conflicts, and deeply divided over the role of American power abroad. But what if that weariness had never taken root? Without Vietnam draining America's spirit and resources, the Cold War could have ended stronger and sooner. Washington, unburdened by defeat in Southeast Asia, might have had more flexibility to support democratic movements in Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union, facing both internal economic decline and sustained Western pressure, might have collapsed earlier. Instead of détente followed by renewed arms races in the 1980s, perhaps a more assertive and diplomatically savvy United States guides the world toward peaceful resolutions by the late 1970s or early 1980s. And what about American politics itself? The Vietnam War helped ignite the deep partisan divides that characterize modern America. Anti-war protests, government deceit, and generational conflicts left lasting scars. Politicians learned to weaponize patriotism or anti-militarism for electoral gain, feeding into the culture wars that still rage today. Without Vietnam, those battle lines might never have been drawn so sharply. The Democratic Party, which splintered between hawks and doves during the war, may have remained more united. Lyndon Johnson's Great Society could have reshaped American life more fully, giving us an earlier national focus on poverty, education, and healthcare. The Republican Party, too, might have followed a different path, less defined by Nixon's Southern strategy and law and order backlash against anti-war protesters. And let's consider America's approach to the world. Without the trauma of Vietnam, there's no Vietnam syndrome, the national reluctance to send troops overseas, born from the pain of a war with no clear purpose. On one hand, this might lead to a more confident America, one willing to intervene decisively when moral imperatives demand it. Humanitarian interventions in places like Rwanda or Bosnia could have found stronger U.S. leadership. On the other hand, without the cautionary tale of Vietnam, It's possible America would have plunged headlong into future conflicts, repeating old mistakes. Would the U.S. have approached Iraq or Afghanistan differently? Would it have been more cautious or more aggressive? History offers no guarantees. And what of Vietnam itself? Without decades of war and isolation, Vietnam could have emerged much sooner as a vibrant democracy or neutral economic powerhouse. In our timeline, Vietnam today is a fast-growing economy, but it still bears the legacy of one-party rule and post-war scars. In this alternate world, Vietnam might have opened its markets in the 1970s or 80s, forging alliances with the West, perhaps even partnering with the U.S. to balance China's regional ambitions. A peaceful Vietnam could have been a linchpin of Southeast Asian diplomacy, a hub of trade connecting East and West, and a bridge between democratic ideals and Asian pragmatism. But beyond politics and economics, the absence of Vietnam changes the very culture and soul of America. The music of the 60s and 70s, rich with protest anthems and anti-war sentiment, would have explored different themes. Artists like Bob Dylan, Jimi Hendrix, and Creedence Clearwater Revival might still have questioned authority. But without the Vietnam War as their canvas, their songs could have focused more on civil rights, environmentalism, or personal freedom. Hollywood's portrayal of war and government might look very different too. Films like Apocalypse Now, The Deer Hunter, and Platoon, deeply critical of American militarism, might never have been made. Instead, American cinema could have explored more optimistic narratives of international cooperation or addressed other domestic struggles that didn't get as much cultural attention at the time. The public's relationship with government would also be dramatically altered. Without the Pentagon Papers revealing years of government deception, without the bitterness over the draft, without nightly news broadcasts showing body counts and burning villages, trust in American institutions might have remained stronger. Watergate may still happen. Nixon's personal failings would not be erased, but it would be seen as an isolated scandal, not as proof of a government fundamentally out of touch with its people. Even America's identity as a global leader could shift. Instead of a wounded superpower grappling with doubt, the United States might project a confident yet compassionate form of leadership, emphasizing diplomacy, aid, and alliance building. This could have reshaped U.S. relations with Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East, regions where Cold War interventions often caused more harm than good. But as much as we might imagine this peaceful alternate world, we must also recognize a harsh truth. No single event, no matter how large, erases all conflict and suffering. Avoiding the Vietnam War wouldn't have solved every problem. There would still be struggles for power, racial tensions at home, and ideological battles abroad. There would still be economic booms and busts, political scandals, and military mistakes. But perhaps, just perhaps, there would be fewer lives lost, less bitterness dividing neighbors, and a world order built more on cooperation than confrontation. And that's a future worth imagining. History is full of crossroads where a single choice can change the fate of nations and generations. What if the Vietnam War had been one of those moments where peace could have prevailed over conflict? But now it's your turn. Do you think the Vietnam War was truly avoidable, or was it inevitable given the Cold War fears of the time? How different do you imagine America and the world would be today if the war had never happened? Would we be stronger, more united, or facing challenges of a different kind? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below. Let's have an honest conversation about this piece of alternate history. And if this video made you think, if it sparked your curiosity or gave you a new perspective on history, please share it with a friend, give it a like, and hit subscribe for more deep dives into the what-ifs that shaped our world. Thank you for watching, and until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep imagining the world not just as it is, but as it could have been.